Welcome to the YouTube channel for the HR M&A Roundtable. I'm Dr. Clint Kendrick, chair of the HR M&A Roundtable and author of the HR Practitioner's Guide to Mergers and Acquisitions Due Diligence. The HR M&A Roundtable is a forum for practitioners teaching practitioners how people, leadership, and culture drive M&A deal value. We provide a variety of opportunities for HR M&A practitioners to connect with one another, including an annual conference, webinars, a Women in HR M&A mastermind group, and of course, roundtables. I started the HR M&A Roundtable because peer learning is an invaluable resource, especially if you're new to the HR M&A space. As an experienced practitioner and HR M&A leader at a Fortune 500 company, I continue to rely on the Roundtable to stay up to date with the latest trends and thinking in HR M&A. You can learn more about the HR M&A Roundtable by visiting www.mdaroundtable.com, where you can find information on our organization and the many resources we provide for HR M&A practitioners. While you're there, sign up for our mailing list so you can stay informed about our upcoming events. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's panel. Our moderator is Kevin Burke. He's the VP of M&A, Private Equity and Venture Capital at Globalization Partners. And again, Globalization Partners is our sponsor. Globalization Partners provides private equity firms with HR, legal, and operational support before, during, and after international transactions. They have a globally compliant employer of record solution that allows sellers to add value to their offering while protecting their IP and the employees. And buyers can speed the deal close with no talent loss by providing a compliant home for transferring employees during a transaction. We're also joined by Rosylin Johnson. She's Senior Director of M&A at McKesson. Mark Walztoni, who's Managing Director of HR M&A Diligence and Talent Integration at Crowe, and Maureen Lowney, who's the Global HR Deal Leader with Cisco. And I'm going to turn it over now to our moderator, Kevin Burke. Kevin, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Clint, and thank you for everyone for joining us today. Really excited about the program. Just going to introduce our panel a little bit further here, and then we'll dive right in. So Mark Walztoni leads Crowe's human capital and M&A practice and assists middle market acquirers and private equity firms to reduce deal risks and accelerate value capture. He specializes in employee communications, change management, building change leadership capabilities, and aligning culture during business transactions, turnarounds, and transformations. Rosylin Johnson currently leads McKesson's people strategy for mergers, acquisitions, and divestitures, from early stage business case development through integration strategy. Her prior experience includes both public and private corporations, private equity, technology, and all things global integration. Maureen Lowney is a global HR deal leader with Cisco, leading deal-based dynamic teams covering early deal planning, due diligence and negotiation, and HR integration strategy. Her experience includes small startups through large enterprise corporations, both privately and publicly held. Thank you again all for joining. I'm really excited about this. Please, a reminder to the audience, please chat in questions along the way. And to our panel, I know we met prior, but if you guys have any stories or anecdotes that you want to share when we get going, don't forget to include those. I know we'd all love to hear them. So without further ado, we'll kick it off. Mark, would love to hear a little bit about your deal experience and how you view retention.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. So my deal experience is really on both sides of the desk. And what I mean by that is I've been a CHRO with a division of Thomson Reuters, iGate Capital, and I've also worked the deal side from the consulting and professional services perspective with E&Y and Crowe. So it's something that's helpful to have that type of perspective. And what I saw on both sides of the desk was just how important retention was. And also that it's a lagging indicator. You know, there's dates out there that deal with how long someone is expected to stay. There's deal objectives out there that are still to be accomplished. So retention is something that really lives through the whole process of the deal. It's not a one and done plan that's executed and you declare victory and walk away.
Yeah, absolutely. Maureen, could you tell us a little bit about your experience and how you view retention?
Sure. So I'm a longtime Cisco person. So all of my M&A experience comes from Cisco, but we are a serial acquirer. So a lot of deals, within our space, mostly like on the small to medium side. So I actually had a deal that was one person at one point, and then our deals go up to like, in the low thousands. The sweet spot is somewhere in the middle, both private and public. And a little bit of divestitures, but mostly focused on acquisitions. In terms of retention, I mean, I think it's really right, like what a company needs to do to keep the talent that was part of the deal in the first place, and how do we best do it, right? How do we drive success around that? I think lenses on this are monetary, non-monetary, like the short term, the longer term, how we segment, right? How we get really strategic and surgical. And overall, to what Mark was saying as well, is that it is attrition is lagging, right? When we start to see those indicators. So how do we drive engagement up front? And I think for all of us, I see a lot of familiar names in this session. Like this is an ongoing conversation, so it's always evolving. And I think that's key for us, is to keep sharing like what we're hearing and what we're doing, and some of the examples, because I just think it's a dynamic thing, and we're constantly just trying to look for the intel to continue to stay ahead of the curve.
Certainly, yeah, absolutely. Rosylin, would love for you to provide your insight on how you view retention as well during a transaction.
So good morning, everyone. So a little bit about my deal experience. So you guys heard in Mark's intro that I have extensive experience, but I've done it both internally as well as from a consulting perspective. And so for me, when I think about retention, it actually assesses a value for how we are viewing target company, especially on the acquisition side, how we are viewing acquisition employees or target company employees, and the potential for business continuity or the lack thereof. So I am very careful when we are putting together retention packages and recommendations, that we are considering both the monetary as well as the non-monetary value associated with that, because it is going to go a long way in helping us to realize the deal value of a transaction, as well as to assist us in engagement for our new employees in our environment. And I have, over the course of my career, done small transactions from as few as 8 to 10 to up to 9,000 employees, and looking at retention going across a breadth and a depth in those transactions to ensure that we are targeting the right employees that we want to stay post any type of monetary retention agreement.
Yeah, and building off that, Maureen, on how have you seen retention drive deal value, as Rosylin was kind of mentioning?
Yeah, so on deals at Cisco, we define value drivers at the very early stages of a deal, and that's what goals do we need to reach to achieve value, and the main three categories around that are financial, in our space, technology, and then people goals. And the people goals and targets are focused on retaining and engaging the team. We actually have we use attrition targets because, and lower than, obviously, right? It's kind of like allowable or tolerable attrition. And we set these looking at, both the targets historical scenario around attrition. We look at our own and get really specific around it. So what technology, what region, what country, and what is that looking at a local level? So we do a lot of, intelligence gathering to look at that. I think that in HR, it's, we see things more easily if deal value starts to get compromised. It's like, if everything's going well and we're doing our work well, the teams are engaged, they're productive, they're not leaving, great. Value drivers are being met, they're staying, and they're focused on the financial and technology goals. I've seen it kind of demonstrate more when it's at risk, where that's more palpable, like where we didn't anticipate a level of attrition and we have to quickly course correct and stabilize. And again, like I think the thread is just information, right? So qualitative, quantitative, this is all about humans. So it's kind of like we need to really understand what's going on. You know, I think just an example of this, you know, a couple of years ago, and I've seen it kind of come up, you know, again as well. But we had one deal where the whole notion of how you handle a sales commission plan, you know, if you're bringing the team in and the timing of that, and we started to see some trends that, you know, again, lagging, we started to see attrition, and we had to dive in deeper and deeper and put more focus on listening and understanding what was going on. And then with that information, create some shifts to the strategy about the timing or elements of the plan that looked a little bit different at that stage, you know, within the first year versus when we first closed the deal. So that's just an example of, I think, where you start to see the value at risk. And it's almost like the, you know, the negative side of this is where our work as, you know, people practitioners, we see it come out. But I think it's just learning, continuous learning, like how do we get ahead of that better the next time? So I think it's just that proactive listening and being on top of any data source that you can to get ahead of the curve.
Yeah, absolutely. Rosylin, same question, you know, how have you seen retention drive deal value from your perspective? I think you're on mute, Rosylin.
Sorry.
That's okay.
I would concur with my colleague Maureen in that if the deal is going well, there is nothing, you know, you're just chugging along, everything's perfect. When it starts to go south, that's when, you know, to her point, you try to get every data element you can to course correct and figure out what's going on and try to address it. Because in integration, we all know as practitioners that that's where deal value is either won or lost. I mean, it really becomes in integration, that's where you either achieve and overachieve what the deal value is and the value drivers, or you plummet. And so I remember very early, like this was probably my second or third deal when I became the global director of M&A integration at McAfee, because that was prior to the Intel acquisition. This was a second or third deal, but I remember we had a new leader at the target company. He had probably been there 6 months before we acquired the company. And we had put these major retention packages in place, and you could hear the rumblings of maybe things weren't going well because the new leader really didn't understand the business. But we were like, okay, you know, it'll be fine, it'll work itself out. And then all of a sudden, you know, as Maureen and Mark have said, attrition is, you know, we started having people like dropping. In 1 month, we had like 8 people, and this company was maybe 55 people when we acquired it. We had 8 people resign in 1 month. And so we were like, okay, wait, what's going on? And me as a new leader, you know, I saw some of the red flags, but I didn't want to address the red flags because I was like, he's a new leader, he's going to course correct. But you could see the red flags with the former CEO, but we did nothing. You know, I didn't push it to say, look, we need to address some of the red flags that are going on with this leader. And he had a substantial retention package, and so did some of these key resources that left in that month. They had substantial retention packages, but we had a huge business continuity issue on our hand at that point, and we were losing. Every day that this went on, we were losing value. So the lesson for me learned in that is you have to, when you see those red flags, you have to address those data points early and often. But not only early and often, sometimes it requires to go back and look at the retention packages that were put in place pre-close or at close and see if they really make sense in the current landscape, especially if you're 4 to 5 months into integration at that point.
Yeah. Mark, would you care to share your thoughts as well?
Sure. So given our question, how does retention affect deal value? I suppose if all of us on the call didn't think there was a connection, we'd we'd be working on our email or doing something else. So I'm going to come at it from a different perspective. Have I ever seen negative retention affect deal value? And the answer is yes, I have. I've seen it when companies say, well, we're going to do a co-CEO model for the first year, or co-CFO model, or we want to be sure that the target feels like they're represented, so we're going to make them 50% of the going forward leadership team. So if you look at it from a retention standpoint, you could say, hey, problem solved, we've retained these people. But what's underneath that is the value erosion piece, the erosion to deal value. And that can be from people in the wrong jobs who don't have the skills or really not the motivation to do really what's required to gather that, to capture that value. And it also makes me think of the triple bump scenario, that as the A players leave, or the people that are put in that maybe aren't the best ones for the job, well, they're more likely to hire B players, and B players are more likely to hire C players. So sometimes it's not only who you retain, but did you retain the right person? And I think that's something that is just a little bit of the flip of thinking about, not that any of us on this call would, but retention good. It's, retention may be good if.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Maureen.
I was just going to add a quick anecdotal story on that as well, Mark. I recall a deal we had where there was a leader of a team, which was a corporate function, and he was really unhappy with the title issue that we all face all the time, right? Yes. And it was interesting because he had been with our company before in a very different role that had a much bigger scope. And coming back in, it was hard because we could not get to that level. There was no way to justify it for the role he was coming in with. Yeah. And we tried every way we could think of with the package and any lever that we had to get him comfortable with the title and kind of talk about the growth opportunities, all the things that you would think would be kind of standard to care for that situation. But to Mark's point, he was so disgruntled that in hindsight, it should have been more of a red flag that the things that we're doing aren't fixing the issue. And so in time, there was a really high level of attrition within that organization. He ultimately left within a short period of time, but it was like the damage was done. And so we, again, I think that story, we still talk about it as a team to say, hey, when we start to see red flags, even if we think we've got a good plan to address it, sometimes you have to keep peeling back the onion and being honest about the fact that it might not be a fit.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And it really ties into our next question well. So, Rosylin, what kind of effort should be spent on retaining, employees at the different organizational levels? Maureen was just kind of touching upon it a little bit there.
Yeah, so here, it just depends on what phase you're in. So if you're in due diligence and you're looking at the key and critical, I would say you were going to put a lot more time in, identifying those key talent resources, those critical talent resources for business continuity. And so for us, like in the current McKesson landscape, that's what we do, pre-deal close. But then post-deal close, we're also looking at those resources that are going to be lower in the organization, but they're critical to us achieving our milestones related to the transaction. So there, I'm not going to say we put as much time in, but we do put time into exploring those resources, understanding their key talents, and then also assessing how critical they're going to be to the future at each level, and who is going to be our our champion. Who are we going to find lower in the organization that is going to champion our cause, champion that change management, and assist us in delivering? And so, when I think of time, I would say, collectively, it may be a couple of hours across 3 or 4 weeks in integration that you're looking at those, because you're getting data points from all levels of management to really understand where those triggers are going to be.
And Mark, same question, retaining, how much time and effort should be spent on retaining employees at different organizational levels?
Yeah, so I would want to tie that into deal cycle, meaning that have to think about retention once you have a letter of intent, perhaps, start working on it, letter of agreement, pre-day one, post-day one, and look at some of that criticality, at each of those phases. I also think this is where deal type comes in. So I read a statistic just the other day that 25% of the forecasted deals for 2001 are going to be talent acquisition or IP types of deals.
Mm-hmm.
So for those types of deals, the time and effort, you put your exponent on it, in terms of the depth. So that's where that's where I think where that fits in as well. The other point I'd want to call out on the different organizational levels is maybe the forgotten middle. And Clint, I think I copped this term from you, but it's really the people in the middle of the organization that are going to be the ones employees go to with their questions or factual questions or questions about, hey, Mary, Joe, how are you feeling about this thing? And what do you think? So I think this gets to the stakeholder idea too. The typical and retention might be around the senior executives, but it's worth asking the questions based on the deal type and how you're going to integrate it as to what's the role of middle management as well. And even that informal network of people who others go to ask questions, but they may not show up on the organizational chart. So those are some thoughts at maybe what levels and how to get at those levels.
Yeah, absolutely. Maureen, same question.
Yeah, so agree with everything Rosylin and Mark shared on this one. I think to add on, we do a very focused effort at the early deal stages around the key employees. And I know like other companies might have like earnout type setups. We have something called a revest, but the idea is that they're earning back part of the deal consideration over a time period. And when we do this, we're starting to set the stage of the whole notion that deal value is delivered over time. It's like the delivery of it is critical, and that it doesn't just happen when the deal closes and there's a liquidation event, right? So that kind of for us starts that most kind of senior key / critical employee level. And then, but I agree, like the segmentation for everyone, including that middle, and in particular for the way that we look at this is around people managers. And so just kind of our company, even outside of acquisitions, we have a hyper focus on leaders and people leaders and the attention that they give their direct reports as one of the greatest influencers on engagement. And we have like a lot of company-wide programs on this. We have a tool called Team Space. We have weekly check-ins. We did away with performance reviews and focus instead on check-ins. And it's the attention from the leaders on their direct reports, again, that we start to see in the data that we can start to predict where there's trouble and where there might be attrition. And so on deals, going back to deals, if we set the stage early about the expectation of those key employees that we really need them signing up to deliver, like we need their leadership to make this successful. And then using that kind of their demonstrated commitment to then influence the other leaders and the people leaders and everyone, right? So it is that kind of leadership trickle down. So, it is that layer of an acquisition approach on that. And in our case, and hopefully in every company, right, you're layering that over how you do this in general for your populations.
Yeah, absolutely. Does anyone else want to add anything before we move on? So it's been mentioned, I know you know, it was brought up a couple of times about monetary and non-monetary retention incentives. So Mark, you know, what are some of the best practices in creating those?
So I think this really goes to the term, I guess you could say, of valence to the person. Not all things mean the same to others, or that they value the value in the same way. So for example, I think from an overall perspective, if you think about non-monetary incentives, I see a lot of value in having people participate in the integration teams, maybe with their colleague at the acquiring company or the target company, to give them a role at the enterprise level where now they're looking from above their silo and seeing how all these pieces fit across the organization, which helps them in their career, regardless of whether or not they stay, I suppose. But just it gives them that career portfolio value. I've been on this team. I've learned some things about communication. I've learned things about improving my abilities to lead change and to help employees be resilient. And now, as a result of going through this, I'm having this one-time event is something that I'm going to look back on, and maybe potential employers will look back on as a make or break moment. So I think this non-monetary piece is really important. Now, having said that, that one size doesn't fit all, but certainly communications, learning change leadership, and participation kind of also takes the notion, we use the acronym, what's in it for me, and I think it really takes it into the next area of what's needed from me. Because I think one of the other non-monetary retention tools is knowing what your role is in the process and being able to contribute. Because without that, I see people sit in the grandstand and wait for it to happen on the field.
Absolutely. Maureen, you know, in your experience, what are some of the best practices you've seen, you know, creating monetary and non-monetary retention incentives?
Sure. Yeah. So I think I'll focus on the non-monetary as well. I think, you know, quickly on the monetary, you know, I feel like we probably all know the basics there on like segmentation and tiering and working with target to, you know, to understand and diligence the most critical talent that we might not know from, you know, the relationship that exists before, et cetera. So and, you know, talked about the kind of revest notion that we do, you know, strategies around how broad you go or how targeted you go, depending on the deal. So I think those are kind of some standard, you know, best practices that we probably all apply. I think on the non-monetary, it's like, it's so big. I mean, there's so much that you can do there. Again, the information gathering on this. So like, we do a lot of, like assessment. So a few examples of this would be, or just like comparison. So we do like a side-by-side comparison of benefits, perks, programs, and we do that around the world. We do a culture inventory through diligence and all of our diligence tracks. We're getting better at this. It's that whole idea of like, you know, does HR own this or does everybody own it? And we need everybody to own that, right? And observing what we call operating behaviors or operating areas to kind of culture. Not everybody resonates with that, but sometimes if you say, you know, how does the company operate? So we can start to get information from the full team working on diligence to understand a good lay of the land. Stakeholder assessments are really hard to do on deals. I'd love to talk about this with others to brainstorm on it, like just when things are moving super fast. But when we do our mapping of the roles and compensation on our deals, we use that as an opportunity to again, like almost categorize. So you're doing that at an individual level, but we also start to see themes, whether it's by function or country or whatever it is, around employee care abouts. And so then you have like all of this information to say what really matters. And so using that then to create a really robust people strategy and communications plan and embed change management through all of that. A couple of quick things like tactics. I think acknowledging pain points, like just being able to say to the acquired teams, like, I hear you, we understand that this issue can be challenging, but then try to steer it more to the macro and more to like the upside. One more thing I think is, and we've talked about this in other sessions, the whole idea of removing distractions, right? So like, we've learned that the perception of something when it's different than reality can really steer things like in a crazy direction. We see this most often on PTO policy. So we have a PTO policy, but a lot of times the companies that we're acquiring have unlimited. And on one particular deal, we learned a lot, and it seems to play out the same way on smaller deals, in that people's perception of the amount of time they're able to take off, it's so different than the actual. Like the actual was like, they take off about 3 or 4 weeks a year, and it's like, okay, great. Like we have a PTO policy that's very consistent with that. Plus we have emergency time off, and we have all of these other leave programs. And so in that way, it's a very emotionally charged, like, you're taking something away from me that right now I have free reign, and now you're going to put me in this like kind of box policy, and it just takes time to get through that. So figuring out how to that's a distraction. That's not real. So how do you get people over the line on something like that? So.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Rosylin, building off Maureen, what are some of the best practices you've seen, creating monetary and non-monetary retention incentives?
So I'll quickly, touch on monetary. So a couple of things that we do, when we're thinking about retention, we think in terms of retention bonuses or additional. Retention bonuses is one thing for us, and then additional cash incentives that are spread across a specified period of time. But then we also look at earnouts, because again, it goes to how we are achieving and how we are, from a business strategy, expected to earn the value of a transaction. So those are just the hardcore tactical things that we focus on when we think about retention. When we think about, and to both Maureen and Mark's point, those non-monetary are where we get tripped up every single time, because it is things that we may not consider as important, but those are, perception becomes reality, and reality, even if it's real or non-real, can, throw everything off the track. So, Maureen said this earlier, and I've seen it time and time again. So one of the things a non-monetary is job title. That, that one thing where it may not be important to you or I, it could be, a huge stepping stone for a leader, or even, that second tier. So, we have to be cognizant of things like job title when we're taking them out of a smaller organization and moving them into a big enterprise. And you have to listen, you have to carefully listen to the conversation when you're extending these offers, especially if job title is something that's brought up. And then, separate and apart from that is management responsibilities. If you have a person that has had broad, swath of responsibilities and flexibility to do multiple things within the organization, and you're now bringing them in, and software developer is a key thing. We see this all the time. Like, they've been able to develop software. They've also been able to do the key, some of the testing on the software, but also some of the strategy and the development. Well, when we bring them in and we're going to put them in a development, they're going to be in a much more isolated area. So with that means, they feel like something is being taken away from them. They don't get to lend as much. So you have to be very cognizant. And I believe Mark said it was, what's in it for me? And a lot of times I find myself taking a step back and saying, while this may not be important to me, how does the employee view this? And what is their experience going to be? Because their experience is going to be what matters to us achieving the deal value. And then lastly, I'll close out by, to Maureen's points, we do a number of assessments, and it's, and it's helping us understand how operating decisions have been made, And so understanding how they have previously made those operating decisions are going to guide us in some of the ways that we're going to retain them in the future. And if it's going to be a matter of they have, and we see this quite often, where I'm not going to say have lax policies, but they're certainly not as structured as some of our policies are. So it is basically being able to talk to and explain why we do what we do that has helped us get over, after we've done the assessment, it's helped us get over that hurdle of, effective communication and change management with the employee base.
Absolutely. And we got a timely question from the audience, that says, kind of really relates to what you're talking about in the non-monetary incentives, but how do you capture the hearts and minds of employees that so that they can make the switch to their new organization?
Yeah, can I just go? It's funny, I just written down hearts and minds in my notes here. So whomever that person is, we have some kind of bond on that. So anyway, and the observation was, and it was actually listening to the discussion here, which is always a wonderful opportunity to learn when you're on a panel from your colleagues. But hearts and minds are really the what's in it for us questions. Whereas the what's in it for me question is, how's it going to affect my bank account? So the hearts and minds piece in terms of tools for that, certainly there's the traditional ways of surveys, focus groups, one-on-ones. I've seen success with identifying those informal influencers. And there's some questions in the chat about that. How do you determine who those people are? Well, I think from a scientific point of view, it can start with social media analysis and that, or just asking, who are the people in the group that are the most influential? Who do they go to with questions, and be able to have some dialogues? I think something else that's just maybe a low-hanging piece as I think about some survey data was it was a survey of the practices of high retention companies and low retention. And only 32%, and this is the high retention companies, said they even talked to the target's leadership team about those questions. Who are the ones that are the critical subject matter experts, process experts, etc. And did you have conversations with them? Only 32%. Whereas on the low retention companies, only 8% of them followed that. So I think the hearts and minds piece, you're really, of course, aiming at the different values and that us value, for us together. And if that's not in the picture, someone's, hey, I'm 95% about the cash, and that other stuff, hey, whatever happens, not my problem. Those are probably the people who'd fall under the poor retention category too. If you're able to smoke out, as Maureen said, what's really important to them, and is there even a possibility that you can provide it?
So Kevin, I would like to kind of follow up on that in the hearts and minds.
Sure.
Part of it is as early as possible as HR practitioners in getting in the deal. So if you're there in pre-LOI, if you're there in due diligence, it is establishing that trust. And, and whoever you're talking to across, if you're talking to the CEO or if you're talking to the founder, whoever you're talking to is early on and often establishing that trust. And once you are able to build that trusting relationship with them, what I found is they may not like the answer. They may not even appreciate the answer, but they can respect the answer. And that will transcend down into the organization also, because what you will find and what you will hear is, we might not like it, but it's fair. And we know it's going to be consistent, and I can buy in and believe what they're telling me.
Yeah, absolutely. Maureen, do you want to add anything? Otherwise, we'll just get to the next one.
I'll just add, I'll add a couple quick thoughts. I think, so agree wholeheartedly with both Rosylin and Mark's comments. It's so funny where Rosylin started to go on the trust building is exactly where my mind went. I'd add to that that early on engagement with like the CEO or whatever leaders you're engaging with when you're doing that trust building, it's the whole notion of like the win-win. Like if you're authentically showing up to say, like, we want the best for the employees, and we're balancing that with what's required of the business or what's required to kind of get to standard terms and all of that. It's like, if you're just showing up saying authentically, like, partner with us to do this in a way that we can get the team best situated, I think, you know, that just makes it so much easier. And that's the way that we, you know, approach our deals and our conversations. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the other piece along with that is just the empathy, like constantly showing empathy for like what the team is experiencing and trying to put ourselves in their shoes. That's something that, you know, you can get a little jaded, like you see it on deal after deal, like even with titles, right? We talk about it because it's like so emotionally charged, but like, we try to step back, take a breather. This is very real for people. And so being able to, you know, demonstrate that empathy and make sure that we're listening and acknowledging for people to feel heard.
Yeah, just something if I can add, Kevin and
Yeah.
It's just a notion that if you don't tell the story, people make up the story, and it's often based on fear. And the other piece I add to that is no happy talk. I don't see it as much. You know, nothing's going to change. Everything's going to be fine. Just wait. You'll hear from us. You know, you'll hear from the Politburo with all the answers, and, you know, just don't worry about anything. I'd say that's an example of lack of empathy, maybe with a positive intent, but the result is the complete opposite.
Absolutely. We in just, you know, in an interest of time here, this is going to be our last question for the panel, and we will try to get a couple of questions from the audience. So it's been a fantastic discussion, and so for this one, Rosylin, I'm going to start with you. You know, how does your thinking change over the course of a deal and integration?
How does my thinking change? Early on, it's making sure we're identifying the right resources from a retention perspective. And it's typically quick also, but then over the course of integration, it shifts to a lens of much more, or are these the right resources? So, you know, early on, it's I want to get the key people locked down because a lot of it's based on initial assessments and due diligence. But over time, it's and in integration, it becomes much more about, are we really identifying the right resources based on our observations and what we're seeing as we have acquired and closed the transaction? And that gives us a much more, a broader view and sensitivity to what kind of packages need to be put in place. Absolutely.
And Mark, your thoughts?
Yeah, so I want to pick up on Rosylin's comment on due diligence, because I'm in violent agreement with it. Is, you know, a lot of good due diligence is about going into something with hypotheses. And early on, when you're thinking about retention, you're thinking about participation and integration, you know, your question could be, is this the right person in the right role with the right level of commitment? And it's important to have check-ins with the right people to be able to validate that at different points, because commitment increases or decreases. Some people might have skills in an environment that's predictable, and now they're in a key role in an environment that's volatile and always changing. And those things are going to change. So I would recommend, and what I've seen be effective, is building that cadence into your retention plan. When are we going to ask those questions? We'll start with our hypothesis right out of due diligence, and then we'll refine that, and we'll really engage the senior members of the team, which certainly HR would be a part of, in testing against the hypothesis. And where there's a change, make a shift. You know, if someone's If someone, for example, is a supporter and they've turned into a skeptic, address the problem. But there's a point where a skeptic can become a cynic, and then that's going to erode things even further. So I would just say, again, develop a hypothesis, test it in a regular cadence, take actions based on your finding.
And Maureen, your thoughts?
Yep, just some quick thoughts about like an approach, so a little bit different lens on this, like the approach of it over time. So I think about it in terms of like a few phases. So there's like the deal piece, like how you're structuring everything around retention, and a lot of what we've talked about today. The next piece is like the close and onboarding. So this is like a stabilization time, right? Like how do you get through that integration when the transitions can feel really difficult, and how do we best support that? And then run the business. And this is where we're evolving our thinking as well, in terms of like the value drivers and kind of how we set realistic targets. I mean, in technology, and I'm sure in many other industries, like the supply of talent and the demand of the roles in certain places, it's really tricky. And so we have to get practical about the fact that we have to look at the time period to deliver on our value drivers. So again, if you think of, for us, financial ones, technology ones, you need the team there and engaged doing the work. Run the business is that last phase, and that goes on indefinitely, but there's a time period within run the business that's most important to deliver that deal value. And so this is what we're exploring more about, how we set those targets and how we look at retention across those phases. And in run the business, what's truly needed for deal success versus where you can look at it like, this is great, the team's staying engaged and they're doing, amazing things at your company in general. So those there.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We have just a couple minutes left, and we're going to try to get to maybe 2 questions from the audience, and this will be rapid fire. So the first one, we've had several questions about assessing leaders. How do you collect and analyze information on key players, and what are the positive and negatives or red flags that you look for? And Rosylin, I'll let you start with that one.
So we don't have, because I've looked at some of the questions.
Okay.
So we don't have a fancy tool. Ours is much more a questionnaire, and we basically make notes based on those questions, on the questionnaire, about different behaviors or assessment of key behaviors that we want to see or behaviors we don't see. And identifying those, the second part of that is identifying those red flags. Sometimes it's just, and I believe Maureen said it, but it's that listening ear. It's not necessarily, one key thing. It's listening to the conversation and the dialogue as it's happening. And I know for me personally, I'll say, oh, I find that interesting. And I'll make a note of it to circle back to see if I can find some data points that are either going to support my position or my hypothesis, or data points that are going to disprove it. So either way, but you'll know the red flags when you hear them. It's not necessarily, I can't say this is a red flag, but you'll know it when you hear it.
Maureen, same question?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always more opportunity for assessment and kind of more structured assessment, very similar to what Rosylin shared. I think oftentimes, and I think it's just how deals work, things are moving so fast, it ends up being observation-based. And so we do the same type thing. It's observing, and it's finding the key players within your own team that is interacting with the target and target leadership to come together and do an iterative debrief series, if that lingo makes sense, to be able to kind of learn and then identify those flags and then figure out proactively the best way to address it. But again, I think always with leadership, so much opportunity to continue to do more there.
Yeah. Mark, any additional thoughts on that?
Yeah, just a couple quick ones. One is in terms of tools. I think a good place to start, if you have a succession management program, look at some of that criteria you're looking at, and maybe look at how those are rated. Ready now, ready 6 months. just those principles. It's not a one-to-one match, but if you're looking for, well, how am I really evaluating people? Go with what you're doing right now. I also find simple things like a 4-box of performance and intent to leave, a 9-box digging into specific characteristics are all helpful, as long as the tool doesn't overcome the other things that Rosylin and Maureen are talking about. So I think it's a balance of some simple tools maybe that are being used already, and integrated in other talent management types of things. And then again, I think part of the value of the M&A practitioner, M&A HR practitioner, is pattern recognition. You know, if you've seen things on different deals, you got to trust it. And that, if anything, is the secret sauce to getting this right.
Fantastic. Well, I think we're going to end there. Really appreciate all the insight. This was a fantastic panel. And Clint, I will send it over to you.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Kevin and Maureen and Rosylin and Mark. Really appreciate you sharing your insights. Thank you for watching this presentation by the HR M&A Roundtable. Please subscribe to our channel so you can be the first to learn when we add new content that will help you in your M&A journey. And be sure to join our mailing list by visiting www.mandaroundtable.com.